So what is it that you're doing at Procore?
So at this point in time, I'm the tech lead on a team that is focused on observability. And so what that really means is we've been around for about 20 years and we use various vendors. And for most of our life cycle, those vendors have been kind of brought in because somebody used them before or brought in because somebody needed a feature that wasn't already there. And in general, it's just kind of organically sourced, and we've gotten to the point where I think we have 5 or 6. And it gets kind of hard to jump around between them when you're in the middle of an incident or just to try to plan and find out where our growth is going.
Yep.
It becomes hard to correlate 5 or 6 tools to do that. So last year there started being an effort on the team I was on at the time. Application infrastructure is what we called that team.
Gotcha.
And that team was supposed to own kind of like service creation. There was talk about them owning like the idea of a service mesh like Envoy or Istio, in particular the way that developers interact with the service mesh.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was talk about them owning this observability space and trying to take these multiple tools and start guiding them towards a more unified purpose, trying to make them work better together or see if replacements exist that would actually improve our ability to observe ourselves. We had a new VP come in and then she's like, this is such an important area that we actually want to dedicate a team to it. So in February, that team was formed and I was the first person to jump over to that team. And then we hired the rest of them around that.
To jump over willingly, or was it,
yeah.
you
no,
wanted
this
to,
was
you
fully
were,
willingly. We actually had a meeting, there was this discussion that we want to have an observability team. And
Gotcha.
that team would fit more under our former SRE area of responsibility than on our dev side. And so we had a meeting with this application infrastructure team and then the other stakeholders on the other side to say, like, where are the lines? What does this team look like? What do each member team kind of contribute? And it came clear that like we wanted to have our application infrastructure team be more of like a liaison to talk about. We should be able to kind of speak for the developers in the company for what we need from an observability tooling.
Mm-hmm.
And then the decision making and the direction setting would be on the other team. And I was like, this meeting happened, I think, on a Friday, and I thought about it for the weekend, and then I came to my manager and I think right after, if I remember correctly, I just told my manager I might be interested in this. I'm going to think about it over the weekend. She said okay, and then that following week I just said, yeah, I'm pretty sure I want to jump on the new team.
Over the weekend. I love it. Quick switch.
Yeah. Took some time to
Sometimes,
talk to who would be my new manager, new director actually, and just kind of fill out for what he expected from the team and if it fit what I would want to be doing, and
mm-hmm.
seemed all like a good lineup. And honestly, I've been very happy since I joined. It's been a really good chance to have really high impact and really get to set direction on something and become an expert on something, which has been satisfying.
Yeah, that is great. I had Harry on my last show and we had talked about, I was just mentioning it offline here, but you hit a point where you're doing a lot of the same thing. And we had alluded a little bit to wanting to become a master in one domain. So you kind of start off on your career and things are a lot more broad and you're really just mucking about saying, yeah, I can fix any project. I can do any project. And then I could definitely see, and for, the listeners' context here, Jim has done, he's been through the gamut of software. He was at Microsoft, he was at Malwarebytes, now he's at Procore. So I can definitely understand wanting to niche down into something more specific like that and kind of master it. So you had this VP come in and she thought the investment in an observability team was absolutely worth it. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on, for those who don't know, maybe the value in having high observability, what observability is, what does it enable, things along those lines.
Yeah. So the context here is like, we were traditionally a monolith-oriented company, and similar to what you see if you read Stripe's public blog, they talk about their journey from my monolith to they're moving towards what they call, I think, microservices is what they're calling them these days. They started as microservices, and they realized that was just too much of a lift, and they also ran into some of the similar problems that you see a lot of companies run into when they try to adopt microservices. That it becomes, you just shift the complexity to somewhere else, and it doesn't become as effective. But
it's a sleight of hand sort of, and it doesn't actually nail
right.
it.
But when done right, you still get benefits from a service-oriented architecture by breaking apart domains and getting to have better clarity on, if I make this change, I know I have a limited blast radius of who I could affect.
Yeah, right. Blast radius is a good way to put it.
The problem, though, is that no matter what you do, if you start to move away from a monolith architecture, your potential sources of problems, they magnify exponentially right away because you have more interaction points, you have more chances for something to go wrong. And that's both in terms of releasing a bug and also in terms of a hard drive failure or network misconfiguration. Like all these points for failure just exponentially increase.
Mm-hmm.
And back when you're dealing with like a single server or a auto-scaling group all doing one thing, it's not too bad to be able to basically just say, okay, I have a pretty simple flow path. I'm just going to instrument everything. And that's where you get tools like Nagios and eventually move into things like Datadog. And these tools work, but they're very geared towards this like monitoring idea, especially like when you're talking about the older ones like Nagios, that's monitoring and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and this mindset of when something goes wrong on a server, I can SSH into that server. I can start telling the logs and I can play around and I can find the problem. I can deploy a single instance of my application that I maybe have modified to be coded to debug, and I can SSH to that box, and I can do this very simple debugging technique. When you start bringing in things like Docker, and especially when you start moving towards like Kubernetes, the idea of I'm going to SSH to this server and I'm going to send a request to that server and I'm going to be able to see everything that's going on and be able to rely on this server staying around while I do all this, it starts to go away. Kubernetes can have scaling events that immediately tear this down mid request. You can't really control where Kubernetes is going to route something to unless you want to take some, extraordinary steps to force certain requests to go to certain services. And even in a properly running production environment, to protect user privacy, to protect PII, to comply with things like SOX and FedRAMP, all those compliance frameworks that exist out there, you have to actually not allow your engineers to SSH to these boxes. Mm-hmm. So you have to be able to figure out what's going on inside of a box from the outside more effectively. And that means shifting how you think about monitoring. No longer are you thinking about these what's called known unknowns. I know this might go wrong, so I'm going to instrument it so that in the future I can find out the value. I know this question I want to ask. That works great again when you have a small number of failure cases. As you move to this distributed world, you lose that ability to really predict what you're going to need to know at the time of a failure. And there's a common phrase in the observability space. One of my favorite people who talks a lot about it is Charity Majors. She's the founder and CTO, if I remember correctly, of Honeycomb.
Gotcha.
And she talks about these unknown unknowns. You don't know what you're going to want to ask in the future, and you obviously don't know the value of that, the answer to that question.
Yep.
And the best way to get to that point is you start instrumenting things in a way that is trying to give more context around what you're doing. So that's where things like structured logging become very important. And then tying those to traces so that any given metric, any given log event can be tied to an operation that performed it. And also, because you have so much context, you can start to group things in very interesting ways. You can say, I have this failure. Well, what correlates with this increase in failure? I'm looking at an aggregate chart of my metrics or aggregate chart of my traces. I see an increase in latency. Well, I can look at that latency change and then identify, well, what is common about the traces that are showing this latency increase? And Honeycomb is kind of a cool tool I've played around with a little bit, and it does that thing for you automatically. You select this baseline and this error and you compare them, and it starts to show you, well, maybe a company ID is different between these traces, maybe a host ID, maybe a deployment zone, maybe a code version. And so that gives you this really quick ability to go from, I know something's wrong, whether that's from an alert or traditional alert or just looking through your charts, to, okay, it's pointing me towards this commit that went wrong, or just this group of servers, something seems wrong. And that helps you then go from detection to identification really fast and be able to start saying, well, now I know this commit did something wrong. I'm just going to dig into the code.
Yeah,
but it's tied to a commit. I believe it's a problem with my code, as opposed to, well, it's this group of servers, so let me get the operations team involved, or let me get my DevOps hat on, and did I misconfigure something in the network or the infrastructure there?
Absolutely. And this is all in the name of, fixing problems more quickly, right? And having that, being able to throw the dart and find exactly where the problem lies, whether that's with the infrastructure or with the code change, like you're saying, availability zones, really interesting stuff. And I actually hadn't considered kind of the downside of observability in the case of Kubernetes, where the example you had, where you could have, a container image that gets pulled down and changed really quickly, and all of a sudden you don't have access to
Right.
it anymore. And then also
Yeah, you don't have.
the flip side of that coin you were talking about, where you have all these regulations that you might need to adhere to as well, where it's actually not allowed for people to SSH in to quickly find out what happened, and things along those lines. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest places it shows value is, like you said, in either preventing or identifying incidents and changing that time. Like, there's a lot of research out there about the fact that, like, there's a measurement called mean time to resolution, which is if you really take, here's when my incident started, here's where it resolved, average that out across all your incidents, and that's a measure.
Yep.
It seems useful at first thought, but the problem is incidents and failures are so widely varied and can be affected by things as wide as, which engineer is investigating. Maybe something started happening a month ago, but because it's a very rare thing, maybe it happens only in batch jobs and it's unfeasible to run those batch jobs out of band, so you have to wait a month. Well, that's going to blow your mean time to resolution, so it makes it a bad measure. I'm a strong believer in the idea that a really good measure for us to really identify if we're moving in the right direction, it's not perfect, unfortunately, but it helps, is this delta between the mean time of detection of a resolution or of an incident and the mean time to identifying what's going on. That's something that these tools can really, really change and drive, and that you get a little bit better scoping on, honestly, to avoid these outliers really throwing you off.
So not the mean time to resolution, but okay, the alarms are going off, something is going wrong, to identifying what actually is going wrong. And then whatever time it takes to fix past that is kind of obviously important, but the time of the alarms going off to knowing what happened, what's going wrong, that's kind of the measure that you're looking at.
Yeah, and that's in particular like being able to tie a measurement to whether or not your tools are helping you is that window right there. Like you said, from identification to resolution is still massively important for some companies. There may be an SLA in place that if you take too long to resolve between that identification and resolution point, you're now having contractual obligations to customers that you have to deal with, and that's obviously still a huge factor. It's just your observability tools don't necessarily come into play there as much as your process for fixing and deploying code becomes a huge portion there. And so that's, like you said, identification and resolution of incidents is very important. I like what Ben Thigelman has said. He's the CTO and co-founder of Lightstep, another company in this space. And he's made a big point about how observability is not just understanding incidents. That's one important area of it, but it's about understanding change. And it's about trying to get the ability to understand any change, whether that's an intentional change. I deployed code, I changed my infrastructure, those are intentional, or unintentional changes. Code failures, incidents are a form of unintentional change. Something breaking is going to be that too. It also can become useful in terms of trying to better understand growth and planning in the future as well. And that's where I like to focus when I push for it here at Procore. I try to say, like, hey, here's where we can really help make a difference in the company.